The cruelest words are often the ones spoken 5 minutes before you lose someone forever. I used to think tears were a weapon, a way to win arguments, a way to bend people with sympathy instead of truth. That belief had kept me alive through years of building an empire where hesitation was expensive and emotions were liabilities. It also became the biggest mistake of my life. The first time I saw Claire Bennett cry, she apologized before wiping away the tears. The 10th time, she smiled through them. By the 100th, I had stopped noticing. Or maybe I forced myself not to. That Tuesday began like every other morning inside the Romano estate. My security team rotated shifts before sunrise. Phones rang with reports from Chicago, Boston, and Miami. Coffee filled the kitchen with its bitter scent while assistants rushed through schedules that looked impossible for any normal person. Outside, the October rain tapped softly against the enormous windows overlooking the gardens. Everything appeared perfectly organized. Everything except the woman quietly falling apart beneath the same roof. Claire moved through the house carrying a tray of breakfast as if every step demanded more strength than she had left. She was 27, with fair skin that looked almost translucent beneath the warm kitchen lights and blonde hair tied into a loose ponytail that had become messier with every passing week. She smiled at everyone she met. She always did. The staff adored her because she remembered birthdays, asked about sick children, and somehow made every person feel seen. I told myself that kindness made people vulnerable. She believed it made people human. We never stopped arguing about that. "Mr. Romano," my assistant said as he followed me toward my office. "The investors will arrive in 40 minutes. I nodded without slowing down. Behind us, I heard the soft clatter of porcelain. Claire had accidentally bumped one cup against another. It wasn't enough to break anything, but it was enough for everyone to glance toward her. She immediately lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. She always apologized, even when nobody blamed her. I kept walking. Halfway down the hallway, I heard footsteps catching up behind me. Claire's voice was barely louder than the rain outside. "Ethan, do you have a minute?" I checked my watch instead of looking at her. "Not now." She hesitated. "It's important." My patience was already thin from 3 sleepless nights and a dozen problems waiting for me downtown. When I finally turned around, I saw fresh tears gathering in her blue eyes. They weren't dramatic. They weren't loud. They simply sat there, trembling, as though she was fighting herself harder than she had ever fought me. One of the housekeepers looked away respectfully. Another pretended to organize flowers on a nearby table. Everyone noticed except the man who should have cared the most. I exhaled sharply. "She's crying again?" I muttered, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Then I gave the sentence that would replay inside my head every night afterward. "Let her cry." Silence settled over the hallway. Claire didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply nodded once, forcing a small smile that somehow hurt more than any accusation ever could. "Okay," she whispered. That single word followed me as I disappeared into my office. Meetings consumed the next several hours. Contracts, negotiations, conference calls, signatures. The world kept demanding pieces of my attention until I almost forgot the look in her eyes. Almost. Around noon, one of the maids knocked softly on my office door. Her face had lost every trace of color. "Mr. Romano," she said, struggling to steady her voice. We can't find Miss Claire." For a moment, I did not understand what the maid had said. The words reached my ears, but they refused to become real. Claire missing? That made no sense. She never disappeared. She always told someone where she was going, even if it was only a walk through the gardens behind the estate. I stood so quickly that my chair slammed into the wall behind me. Every conversation inside the conference room stopped. Half a dozen executives stared as I walked straight past them without another word. My assistant hurried after me, struggling to match my pace. "Every camera is already being checked," he said. "The guards are searching the grounds." I ignored the elevator and took the stairs 2 at a time. The polished marble that usually reflected confidence now echoed with something unfamiliar inside me. Unease. By the time I reached the main floor, the entire household had fallen into nervous silence. Housekeepers stood together whispering. Security officers spoke into radios with calm voices that failed to hide the urgency beneath them. Claire's phone rested on the kitchen counter beside an untouched cup of tea that had already gone cold. She never went anywhere without her phone. I picked it up. The screen lit for a second before fading again. No missed calls. No messages. Just a photograph of us taken nearly a year earlier during a charity event. She had been laughing because I had finally agreed to wear a ridiculous holiday sweater for the children's fundraiser. I remembered pretending to hate every second of it. Looking at that picture now, I realized it had been one of the few genuine smiles I had ever allowed myself. "We found something," one of the guards called through his radio. My heartbeat quickened before I could stop it. They had located her in the glass conservatory at the far end of the property. A place she loved because it stayed warm even when autumn covered everything outside with cold rain. I reached the building before anyone else. Moisture covered the glass walls, turning the flowers inside into soft blurs of color. The air smelled of wet soil, roses, and fresh lavender. Claire was lying on the wooden bench near the center of the room, one hand resting against her side as though she had simply fallen asleep while watching the rain. "Claire." I crossed the room faster than I thought possible. She did not answer. Her breathing was shallow. Her face was almost as pale as the white orchids blooming behind her. A small notebook had slipped from her lap onto the floor beside the bench. I knelt beside her and touched her hand. It felt colder than it should have. "Call an ambulance," I ordered. "Now." Nobody questioned me. Within seconds, voices filled the conservatory as security coordinated with emergency responders. One of the housekeepers quietly picked up Claire's sweater that had slipped from her shoulders and gently covered her with it. "She was here this morning," the woman whispered with tears in her eyes. "She said she only wanted a little quiet." Quiet. That was all she had asked for. While we waited, I noticed something resting beside the notebook. A small paper bag from the neighborhood bakery she visited every Friday. Inside was a cinnamon roll that had never been opened. She had bought my favorite breakfast even after I dismissed her without a second thought. My chest tightened in a way I had never experienced before. Sirens finally echoed through the estate, growing louder until red and blue lights reflected across the rain-covered windows. The paramedics moved with calm efficiency, checking her pulse, speaking softly, asking questions none of us could answer. One of them looked up at me with careful eyes. "How long has she been feeling unwell?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. I did not know. I had memorized the schedules of hundreds of employees, remembered the birthdays of powerful clients, and tracked every dollar moving through my business. Yet I could not answer the simplest question about the woman who had been living under my roof. As they carried Claire toward the waiting ambulance, her fingers loosened slightly, and the notebook slipped from beneath the blanket onto the wet stone path behind us. Neither of us noticed it then. By nightfall, I would discover it contained everything I had never bothered to ask. The emergency room felt strangely quiet despite the constant movement around us. Nurses walked quickly between stations. Monitors beeped in steady rhythms. Rain continued sliding down the tall hospital windows, turning the afternoon into a blur of gray light. I stood outside Claire's treatment room with my hands in my pockets because I did not trust them to stay still. I had spent years negotiating with politicians, investors, and men who built entire careers on intimidation. None of them had ever unsettled me the way a closed hospital door did. After what felt like hours, although the clock insisted it had only been 32 minutes, a physician stepped into the hallway, holding a tablet. His expression was calm, professional, and somehow that frightened me even more. "Mr. Romano?" I nodded. "She is stable." The pressure inside my chest eased for exactly one heartbeat before his next sentence shattered it again. "But she has been living with severe exhaustion for quite some time. This did not happen overnight." I stared at him without speaking. He continued carefully, almost as if he had already realized I was the kind of man people usually chose their words around. Her blood work shows significant nutritional deficiencies. She is dehydrated, physically exhausted, and her body has been compensating for months. People rarely reach this point after one difficult week. This is usually the result of prolonged neglect of their own health. Neglect. The word echoed through my mind. Claire never neglected anything. She remembered everyone's appointments. She reminded the staff to eat lunch. She left handwritten birthday cards for employees whose names most executives never even learned. She would stay awake all night comforting someone else without ever mentioning that she needed rest herself. Why would she hide it? I finally asked. The physician lowered the tablet slightly. Many people who spend their lives caring for others become experts at hiding their own pain. They convince themselves they can deal with it tomorrow. Then tomorrow becomes months. He paused before adding quietly, "Did she recently experience increased emotional stress?" I could not answer. Instead, memories answered for me. Claire pushing food around her plate while insisting she had already eaten. Claire rubbing her temples before smiling whenever someone walked into the room. Claire quietly leaving meetings early because she claimed she had paperwork to finish. Claire standing outside my office several times over the past month asking if I had a minute. Every single time I had found another reason to say no. The physician's voice pulled me back. She should recover, but only if she rests and receives proper support. Recovery is not only physical. She has been carrying something heavy for a long time. Support. Such a simple word. Yet I suddenly realized how little of it I had given her. When the doctor walked away, I remained frozen outside the room. Through the narrow glass window, I could see Claire sleeping peacefully beneath a warm blanket. Without the color in her cheeks, she looked younger somehow, almost like the woman I had first met 3 years earlier at a community fundraiser, where she had convinced a frightened little girl to smile simply by sitting beside her on the sidewalk with an ice cream cone. She had changed countless lives without asking for recognition. I had somehow become the one person who stopped seeing her altogether. A soft voice interrupted my thoughts. It was Margaret, the senior housekeeper who had worked for my family longer than anyone else. She held something carefully in both hands. Claire's notebook, the one that had fallen beside the conservatory bench. "I thought you should have this," she whispered. "She never let anyone read it. But maybe now you need to understand." I accepted the worn leather journal, feeling its surprising weight. A faded ribbon marked a page somewhere near the middle. I told myself I should respect her privacy. I told myself I had no right to read it. Yet as I looked through the hospital window one more time and saw Claire lying there with machines quietly tracking the heartbeat I had taken for granted, I realized the greatest violation had never been opening her journal. It had been never asking what was breaking her heart in the first place. I waited until the hallway outside Claire's room grew quiet before I opened the notebook. The leather cover was worn smooth around the edges, as though she had carried it everywhere for years. There were no dramatic confessions on the first page. No desperate pleas for help. Just neat handwriting and a simple sentence. "If I write it here, maybe I can smile tomorrow." My throat tightened before I even turned the next page. Every entry looked ordinary at first. Grocery lists, birthday reminders for members of the staff, recipes she wanted the kitchen to try during Thanksgiving, notes about flowers blooming too early because of the warm September weather. It looked like the journal of someone whose greatest concern was making life a little brighter for everyone else. Then I reached the pages marked with dates from the previous month. Today Ethan skipped lunch again. I left soup outside his office. He never knew it was me, but at least he ate. Another page. Margaret's grandson passed his college entrance exams. We should bake him a pie tomorrow. Another. One of the new guards looked lonely. I hope someone invited him to dinner. Page after page, she noticed everyone. She carried everyone. Everyone except herself. My fingers stopped on an entry written only 3 days before she collapsed. The handwriting looked less steady than the earlier pages. I was dizzy again this morning. I almost dropped the coffee tray. I hope nobody noticed because they already worry too much. I closed my eyes for a moment before forcing myself to continue. The headaches are happening more often now. I should probably see a doctor, but Ethan has enough on his mind. His meeting with the investors is next week. I will wait until everything settles down. She had postponed taking care of herself because she thought my schedule mattered more than her health. I swallowed hard and turned another page. There was no bitterness, no anger, not even disappointment. Instead, I found something infinitely harder to read. Sometimes I cry before I knock on his office door, not because I expect him to fix everything, just because hearing his voice reminds me that I am not alone. On the days he is too busy, I tell myself tomorrow will be different. My chest felt unbearably heavy. Tomorrow. She had built an entire future out of tomorrows that never came because I kept replacing them with meetings, contracts, flights, and deadlines. I looked through the hospital window again. Claire remained asleep, peaceful in a way I had not seen for months. The machines beside her bed measured every heartbeat while I silently measured every opportunity one had wasted. A gentle knock interrupted my thoughts. Margaret stepped into the waiting area carrying a small canvas tote bag. "These are her things from the estate," she said softly. Inside were reading glasses, a sweater she always kept nearby because she was constantly cold, a half-finished knitting project she had started for one of the gardeners expecting his first granddaughter, and a bottle of vitamins that was still almost completely full. The expiration date caught my attention. She had purchased them 6 months earlier. Nearly untouched. Margaret noticed where I was looking and sighed quietly. She always remembered to remind everyone else to take care of themselves, she said. She just never believed she deserved the same kindness. After Margaret walked away, I opened the notebook one final time. Tucked between 2 pages was a folded piece of paper. It was not a letter. It was a checklist written in Claire's careful handwriting. Every line began with someone else's name. Buy medicine for Margaret's arthritis. Call David's mother after her surgery. Order birthday balloons for Olivia. Make Ethan's favorite cinnamon rolls on Friday because he smiles without realizing it when they are still warm. There was only one unchecked item at the bottom of the page. Schedule my own appointment. Beside it, she had written 3 tiny words that shattered whatever remained of the man I used to be. Maybe next week. Sleep never came that night. The hospital offered a private family lounge with comfortable chairs, fresh coffee, and quiet lighting. But none of those things could silence the noise inside my head. I remained outside Claire's room, watching the steady rise and fall of her breathing through the glass. Every few minutes a nurse adjusted an intravenous line or checked her monitor before leaving as quietly as they had entered. They treated her with the kind of gentle attention she had always given everyone else. It made me wonder how many chances I had ignored to do the same. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, my phone vibrated again. Another executive wanted approval for a business decision worth millions of dollars. Without even reading the message, I turned the phone completely off. The silence that followed felt unfamiliar. For years, I had believed every call demanded an answer. Every meeting required my presence. Every problem rested on my shoulders. Yet the only place I wanted to be was the chair beside Claire's hospital bed. I quietly walked inside after the nurse assured me she needed uninterrupted rest, but that I could stay as long as I remained calm. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and fresh linen. A small reading lamp cast a warm glow across the blanket covering her shoulders. Without the constant smile she wore for everyone else, her face looked tired in a way I had never allowed myself to notice. I pulled a chair closer and sat beside her. For several minutes, I simply listened to the soft rhythm of the heart monitor. It was strange how one quiet sound could make an entire empire feel insignificant. I looked down at my hands and remembered every time those same hands had signed contracts, shaken hands with powerful people, or pointed someone toward another task because I was too busy. Somehow they had never reached out when Claire needed them most. My assistant knocked softly before stepping into the room. He carried a tablet filled with tomorrow's schedule. "The board meeting has been confirmed for 9 o'clock, he said carefully. "The investors are expecting you." I looked at the screen for less than a second before pushing it back toward him. "Cancel everything." He blinked in surprise. "Everything. Everything," He hesitated because in all the years he had worked for me, I had never canceled an entire day. I had attended meetings with broken ribs, negotiated contracts while recovering from pneumonia, and once participated in a conference call from an airport after being awake for almost 48 hours. Work had always come first because I believed it protected the people I cared about. Now I realized that protecting someone meant being present long before they collapsed. My assistant nodded quietly. I understand. As he turned to leave, I stopped him. There is something else. He waited. Starting today, every employee at the estate receives a full annual medical examination during work hours. Paid in full. No exceptions. If anyone says they are too busy, remind them that I gave the order. He smiled faintly. Claire suggested something similar almost a year ago. His words landed harder than he probably intended. Of course she had. She had tried to take care of everyone while I had been too distracted to listen. After he left, I noticed a folded envelope resting inside Claire's tote bag. My name was written across the front in her careful handwriting. It had never been sealed. My fingers trembled slightly as I unfolded the paper inside. The letter was unfinished, ending halfway through the final sentence. Dear Ethan, I know you have been carrying more than anyone realizes. I wish you understood that you do not always have to be strong. Sometimes I worry that you think asking for help means failing. I wanted to tell you that even on your hardest days, the sentence ended there. The rest of the page remained blank. She had run out of time before finishing the thought. I lowered the letter and looked back at Claire sleeping peacefully beneath the soft hospital lights. For the first time in my life, I did not feel like the strongest man in the room. I felt like the one who had needed saving all along, and the only person who had ever truly known it was still asleep, carrying a kindness I had spent far too long mistaking for weakness. Morning arrived without bringing relief. Pale sunlight filtered through the hospital windows, replacing the cold gray rain with a quiet golden glow that should have felt hopeful. Instead, it only revealed how exhausted I had become. I had not left Claire's bedside except to speak briefly with her physicians, and every update sounded almost identical. She was stable. She needed time. Her body was finally resting after months of pretending it did not need to. I sat beside her with the unfinished letter folded carefully inside my jacket pocket. Every few minutes I caught myself looking toward the door, expecting someone to walk in and explain that this had all been a misunderstanding. No explanation ever came because the truth had already been sitting beside me the entire time. It was just one I had refused to see. Later that morning, Margaret quietly entered the room carrying a small paper box tied with a faded blue ribbon. I found this in the pantry, she said gently. Claire asked the kitchen to keep it fresh every Friday. I opened the box and immediately recognized the sweet scent of cinnamon. Inside were 6 homemade cinnamon rolls, still wrapped individually. Attached to the lid was a small handwritten note. If Ethan skips breakfast again, please leave one outside his office before 9 o'clock. He pretends he is not hungry, but he always eats it once nobody is watching. I stared at the note until the words blurred together. She had memorized my habits with remarkable patience while I had overlooked the warning signs she carried every single day. Margaret remained silent for a moment before speaking again. Do you know why she cried so often recently? I slowly shook my head. She looked down at her hands. Neither did we. Every time someone asked, she smiled and changed the subject. She always protected everyone else's feelings before her own. After she left, I walked into the hallway searching for fresh air, but the walls seemed to close around me instead. A young father was helping his little daughter walk beside him after a routine checkup. She reached for his hand without thinking, and he immediately slowed his pace to match hers. Such a simple gesture, so effortless. I wondered how many times Claire had reached for me in quieter ways that never looked dramatic enough for me to notice. Back inside the room, my assistant approached with a folder containing reports from the estate. Security completed the camera review, he said carefully. There was nothing suspicious. I accepted the folder anyway. Hour after hour, I watched the recordings from the previous weeks. Claire greeting every employee with the same warm smile. Claire leaving books outside the staff lounge for anyone who wanted to borrow them. Claire quietly placing fresh flowers in empty spaces because she believed beauty could change a difficult day. Then another recording appeared. She paused outside my office door holding 2 mugs of coffee. She took a deep breath, wiped away tears with the sleeve of her sweater, smiled at her own reflection in the glass, and knocked. A minute later she walked away alone, still carrying both cups. The timestamp matched a morning I barely remembered. I had been preparing for an important meeting. I never even opened the door. Another recording showed her sitting alone in the conservatory just before sunset. She looked toward the estate as if hoping someone might come looking for her. After several minutes she quietly stood, brushed away another tear, and walked back inside with that familiar smile already waiting on her face. I closed the tablet because I could not bear another second. There had never been a hidden enemy plotting against Claire. There had never been a stranger responsible for the sadness growing behind her eyes. The person who had dismissed her tears, postponed her hopes, and convinced her that tomorrow would always be enough was sitting in the chair beside her hospital bed. For years I believed the greatest threat to the people I loved would come from somewhere outside my walls. I finally understood the truth. The man Claire had been waiting for to notice her pain had always been me, and I had arrived far too late. By the 3rd morning, the hospital had become the only place in the world that mattered to me. The endless stream of business updates had stopped because everyone finally understood that I was not coming back until Claire did. My office downtown remained empty. Meetings were postponed indefinitely. Deals that once seemed urgent no longer deserved a second thought. Every morning I walked the same quiet hallway before sunrise, carrying a fresh cinnamon roll from the bakery she loved, even though I knew she could not eat it yet. I placed it beside the window anyway because the warm scent reminded me of home, and I hoped that somewhere beneath the silence surrounding her, she could still recognize familiar things. Her physician entered with a reassuring smile that I had not seen before. Her vital signs continue to improve, he said. The hardest part now is giving her body and mind enough peace to recover. Healing is rarely fast when someone has ignored their own needs for so long. I thanked him, but his words stayed with me long after he left. Peace. I had spent years believing I could solve every problem with resources, influence, and careful planning. Yet none of those things could purchase the one gift Claire needed most. Time to breathe without carrying everyone else's burdens. That afternoon I returned to the estate for the first time since bringing her to the hospital. The house felt strangely different. It was spotless as always, but something essential was missing. The laughter she shared with the kitchen staff had disappeared. Fresh flowers no longer appeared in unexpected corners. Even the golden retriever she had rescued years earlier wandered through the hallways, searching every room before quietly lying outside her bedroom door. The entire house seemed to be waiting for her. I walked into the conservatory where she had been found. Rain had finally stopped, leaving tiny drops of water sparkling across the glass ceiling as sunlight poured through the windows. The wooden bench remained exactly where it had been. Beside it sat a small watering can and several healthy orchids blooming with remarkable color. Margaret noticed me standing there. She watered them every morning, she said softly, even on the days she barely had enough strength to stand. I looked around the room and realized every flower was alive, because Claire had continued caring for them while quietly neglecting herself. Before leaving the estate, I gathered every employee in the main living room. Some looked nervous because they had rarely seen me call everyone together without a formal reason. I looked at each familiar face before speaking. For years, I believed success meant never slowing down, I said quietly. I was wrong. Starting today, no one in this house will apologize for needing rest, asking for help, or taking care of their health. If anyone feels overwhelmed, you speak. If someone else is struggling, you listen. Those are no longer suggestions. They are expectations. The room remained silent until Margaret wiped away a tear and nodded. I returned to the hospital before sunset carrying a small bouquet of white lilies because they had always been Claire's favorite. The nurse smiled as she helped place them beside the window. She is stronger today, she whispered. Sometimes patience here more than we realize. I pulled my chair beside Claire's bed once again and gently took her hand. It felt warmer than it had only a day earlier. For the first time since she collapsed, I allowed myself to believe she was finding her way back. I leaned closer, speaking quietly enough that only she could hear if she truly was listening. You spent years making sure nobody around you ever felt alone, I whispered. I cannot change everything I failed to see, but I can change every day that comes after this one. I will be here tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day you need me. Her fingers remained still for several long seconds. Then, almost too gently to notice, they gave the slightest squeeze around my hand. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough to make hope feel real again. When I opened my eyes the next morning, I realized I had fallen asleep with my hand still wrapped around Claire's. It was the first real sleep I had managed in days, and somehow it had come only because I refused to let go. The early sunlight painted soft patterns across the hospital room, warming the white walls with shades of gold instead of gray. For the first time since everything changed, the room no longer felt cold. A nurse quietly entered to check the monitors. She smiled as she glanced toward Claire before looking back at me. She has been responding well all night, she said. I think today will be a good day. I thanked her with a quiet nod, afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow interrupt the fragile hope filling the room. I stood and adjusted the bouquet of white lilies beside the window. Their fragrance mixed gently with the scent of fresh coffee drifting through the hallway. It reminded me of ordinary mornings, the kind I had always rushed through without appreciating. My phone remained switched off inside my jacket pocket. The world outside could continue without me for another day. Claire could not. As I returned to my chair, I noticed the slightest movement beneath the blanket. Her fingers shifted again, stronger than before. A few seconds later, her eyelashes fluttered against her cheeks. My heart pounded so loudly that I was certain the monitor beside her could hear it too. Slowly, almost uncertainly, her blue eyes opened. They wandered across the room before, finally settling on me. There was confusion at first, then recognition, followed by the same gentle expression she had always worn whenever she looked at me. I leaned forward carefully. Claire. My voice barely rose above a whisper. She blinked several times as if trying to gather her thoughts. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I reached for the glass of water the nurse had prepared and helped her take a small sip. She smiled faintly in appreciation before looking at me again. I expected questions. I expected fear. I expected her to ask what had happened. Instead, the very first words she spoke broke something inside me forever. I am sorry, she whispered softly. Her voice was weak but unmistakable. Did I make your week more difficult? I stared at her in complete disbelief. She had awakened in a hospital bed after pushing herself beyond her limits for months, and her first concern was whether she had become another burden for me. I felt my eyes burn with tears I no longer cared to hide. I slowly shook my head. No, I answered, struggling to keep my voice steady. Claire, you never made my life harder. She looked at me with quiet uncertainty, as though she was waiting for me to correct myself. I know you have been busy, she said. I kept thinking if I could just stop crying, maybe you would not have one more thing to worry about. Every word carried no accusation, only kindness, only concern for the man who had failed to notice her suffering. I lowered my head for a moment before meeting her eyes again. I was the one who failed, I admitted. I saw your tears and convinced myself they did not matter because I was too proud to ask why they were there. I kept believing there would always be another tomorrow to listen. I was wrong. The room became quiet except for the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. Claire studied my face as if she had never seen it without the walls I always hid behind. Then, with surprising effort, she reached toward my cheek and gently brushed away a tear with the back of her hand. A faint smile appeared on her face. You finally let yourself cry, she whispered. I laughed softly through the tears because she was right. After everything that had happened, the strongest thing I had done was stop pretending I had to be strong all the time. At that moment I understood that Claire had never wanted my power, my success, or my protection. She had only wanted my attention, and I silently promised myself that I would never again make the woman who noticed everyone else wonder whether anyone truly noticed her. 3 weeks later, the autumn rain had finally given way to clear blue skies, and the Romano estate looked alive again. Sunlight poured through the conservatory windows, touching every orchid Claire had once worried would fade without her. They had not faded. They had simply waited for the hands that loved them to return. Just like I had. Claire was still recovering, moving more slowly than before and following every instruction her physicians gave her. Something she admitted with a laugh would have been impossible if I had not insisted on attending every appointment beside her. The staff often smiled when they saw us walking through the gardens together. They were no longer surprised that my phone stayed in my pocket or that business meetings ended before dinner. They had quietly accepted what I had finally learned. No achievement meant anything if it cost the people waiting for you at home. The changes inside the estate reached far beyond my own schedule. Every employee now received regular health checkups, counseling services if they wanted them, and mandatory vacation time. Margaret laughed the first time someone reminded her to leave work early because she looked tired. David proudly framed a photograph of his newborn niece beside his desk after taking paid family leave. Even the newest employees quickly realized something had changed. The house still ran with discipline, but kindness had become part of its foundation. One afternoon, I found Claire sitting in the conservatory with her notebook resting on her lap. She was not writing. She was simply watching the sunlight move across the flowers. I sat beside her without saying anything. We had discovered that silence no longer needed to be filled. After a few peaceful minutes, she opened the notebook and carefully crossed out the unfinished line that had haunted me since the hospital. Schedule my own appointment. Then she smiled before writing a new sentence beneath it. Keep every promise I make to myself. I looked at her and quietly asked, "May I add something?" She handed me the notebook without hesitation. I took the pen and wrote only one line. You never have to carry tomorrow alone again. When I gave it back, she read the words slowly. Tears gathered in her eyes, but this time they were different. There was no loneliness behind them, no quiet surrender, only relief. She reached for my hand, and I held hers without fear of appearing weak. Strength, I had finally learned, was never measured by how much pain someone could hide. It was measured by how willing they were to stay when another person needed them most. A few days later, the bakery delivered its usual box of cinnamon rolls. Claire laughed when she caught me carrying one toward my office. "You know," she teased gently, "you could have just admitted you liked them years ago." I smiled and broke the roll in half before handing the larger piece to her. "I was wrong about a lot of things," I admitted. "I do not plan on repeating those mistakes." She leaned her head lightly against my shoulder as we watched the afternoon light settle over the gardens. Nothing dramatic happened in that moment. No grand speeches. No extraordinary celebration. Just two ordinary people sharing peace that had once felt impossible. Looking back now, people often assume the biggest turning point in my life was building an empire, earning influence, or becoming the man everyone feared. They are all wrong. My life changed the day I finally understood that the strongest person in my world had been quietly asking for compassion instead of admiration. I could command rooms filled with powerful people, but I almost lost the one person who only wanted me to notice her tears. If the story has taught me anything, it is this. The people who smile the most are not always the ones hurting the least. Sometimes love is not proven by protecting someone from the world. Sometimes love begins with something much smaller, much quieter, and infinitely more difficult. Begins when you stop long enough to ask, "Are you really okay?" and then care enough to stay for the answer.